It is already week 4 of the fantasy football season. My name is Steven Andrus, and we have everything you need to know to get your lineup set for week 4. This is the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. As always, we begin every show with Pick 'em Up, our waiver wire segment featuring players owned in fewer than 50% of leagues. And we start at running back in New England. It's Rex Burkhead, a fantasy darling of seasons past. He is creeping up again. And if you look at his production from week number 3, it was impressive. Against the New York Jets with James White out, Burkhead had 11 carries for 47 yards and a touchdown, and he added 6 receptions as well for 22 yards. Now, some of you may be saying, well, that was only because James White is out. But it is my belief that there is a chance that Burkhead starts eating into Sony Michel's work. In that same game, yes, Sony Michel had a touchdown, but only 9 carries for 11 yards. And in 2 games this year against teams not named the Miami Dolphins, 24 carries for only 25 yards for Sony Michel. We know Bill Belichick will play the best possible player at any moment. And right now, that's Rex Burkhead over Sony Michel. He should be rostered in every fantasy football league moving forward. He could turn into an every week RB2. Moving on to the Kansas City backfield, and with Damian Williams out week 3, it was not the rookie Darwin Thompson who got the work. We had a surprise indication pregame from warmups that it might be Darell Williams, and it was in fact Darell Williams. A no-name guy that most of us didn't know before last week, but he was fantastic in relief of Damian Williams against Baltimore. 9 carries for 62 yards. He added 5 receptions for 47 yards. If Damian Williams is out again this week, Darell Williams becomes a solid flex option for week 4 in that split backfield with LaShawn McCoy. Now at wide receiver, most of the high-performing players from last week are already rostered in more than 50% of leagues, but there is a player out there that's suspended that I think is worth picking up a week early to beat the rest of your league mates to the punch, and it's Giants wide receiver Golden Tate. Again, serving a 4-game suspension. He's out for week 4, but with Daniel Jones balling at quarterback, he can sustain multiple receivers at this point. Golden Tate becomes a decent flex option when he comes back. Combine that with Saquon Barkley's high ankle sprain. He's likely out multiple weeks. Beat your competition to the punch and go get Golden Tate 1 week early before he comes back from his hiatus. Let's move on to the stream team. Quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses owned in fewer than 50% of leagues that you can not only pick up, but start in week number 4. And we begin at quarterback with the aforementioned Danny Dimes, the rookie out of Duke that we all made fun of the Giants for taking at the NFL draft. We all have egg on our face because this kid can play. His NFL debut, 336 passing yards, 4 total touchdowns at Tampa Bay. The overall QB2 behind Russell Wilson with 34.2 fantasy points in standard scoring. He gets Washington this week, who have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks at more than 25 per game. And Daniel Jones, even more impressively, was under pressure 47% of his dropbacks, the 3rd highest rate in week 3, but he completed 80% of those pressured attempts for 233 yards and 2 touchdowns and a perfect 158.3 passer rating. Daniel Jones can flat out play. We saw signs of that in the preseason. Our next streaming option at quarterback is Jacoby Brissett of the Indianapolis Colts. Granted, not nearly as exciting as Danny Dimes, but he's playing really well under head coach Frank Reich. Look at what he's done in recent weeks. In week 2 against Tennessee, his first career 3-touchdown game. In week 3 against Atlanta, 28 for 37, 310 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's now 7 touchdowns to just 1 interception on the year. He gets to take on Oakland in week 4. Oakland's fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, 19.6 fantasy points per game. Moving on to streaming tight ends, again, options owned in less than half of leagues. Will Dissly of the Seahawks. I think he's a viable option moving forward now in this passing game with Russell Wilson. Look at what he's done in the past 2 weeks. Week 2, 5 catches, 50 yards, 2 touchdowns. Week 3, 6 receptions, 61 yards, and a touchdown on 7 targets. He gets Arizona this week on the road. The Cardinals have allowed 29 fantasy points per game to tight ends. That is worse than the league, and it's not even close. The next closest, 18.3 fantasy points per game. Start any tight end for the most part this year that's playing the Arizona Cardinals. If you're desperate, there's another option, maybe Eric Ebron of the Indianapolis Colts. T.Y. Hilton went out with a quad injury, so they're going to have to spread the ball around a little bit more if their number one wide receiver is out. Ebron has been average at best to start the year. Didn't have a touchdown in week 3, 3 receptions for 47 yards. In week 2, he did find the end zone on just 25 yards receiving. But again, if Hilton is out, he becomes an option. Our streaming defense options for week 4 become a little bit more difficult when the Dolphins are playing a defense that are rostered in more than 50% of leagues and the Jets are on a bye. So we got to go a little bit deeper this week. And let's start with the Indianapolis Colts defense. They get to take on the Raiders at home this week. The Raiders are going from west to east. They're playing at a 10 a.m. Pacific game time for them on the East Coast. So Oakland in week 2 against Kansas City, their offense had 2 turnovers and 3 sacks. In week 3 against Minnesota, they only scored 14 points as an offense, had a turnover and 4 sacks as well. Yes, the Colts defense isn't exciting, but Oakland's offense has been poor, so we're looking for defenses to stream against poor offenses. Our next option is the Atlanta Falcons defense, and again, did not play great on the road against Indianapolis in a dome environment, but I was very impressed with what this Falcons defense looked like week 2 at home, and the Falcons are at home again in week number 4. They get to take on the Tennessee Titans, and again, that's the key, a struggling offense. The Titans have allowed 17 sacks in 3 games this year, 24 combined points for the Titans offense in their last 2 games against the Colts and Jaguars. That's a pretty good option to stream against. And the Falcons, that week 2 matchup against a good Eagles offense in Atlanta, 3 turnovers and 3 sacks. I think the Falcons are a viable streaming option for week number 4. Moving on to stealthy starts before we wrap up the show. These are players who you typically would not put in your starting lineups, but due to matchups in week 4, I think you can put in and get flex value if you just hold your nose a little bit and don't worry about the name. He will produce for you. It's Carlos Hyde of the Houston Texans. He was bad in week 3, I get it. He saved most people who did start him with a cheap touchdown against the Chargers, but look at his usage since arriving in Houston. His touches by week, 11 week 1, 20 touches in week 2, 10 touches with that touchdown in week 3, and his snap percentages. He started with 37% of snaps on week 1, then that skyrocketed to 61% of snaps in week 2, and still played the majority of snaps, 52% week 3. He is playing far more than Duke Johnson at this point, despite the fact that the Texans spent a 3rd-round pick to acquire Duke Johnson in the preseason. At wide receiver, it's Marquez Valdes-Scantling. This one you're probably going to be excited about. He's playing really well lately after a slow start. It is Thursday night against the Eagles at Lambeau Field, so keep that in mind. But Scantling is doing very well of late. The last 3 games for MVS, 6 targets, 5 targets, and then 10 targets last week against the Broncos. In week 3, 6 receptions for 99 yards and a touchdown. And the Eagles, the 4th most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers this season. Our last stealthy start for week number 4 is Curtis Samuel of the Carolina Panthers, and apparently this guy is quarterback proof. Doesn't matter if Cam Newton's a quarterback, doesn't matter if the backup Kyle Allen is at QB, Curtis Samuel is a route running stud. Look at what he's done in recent weeks. In week 3 with Kyle Allen on 7 targets, 5 receptions for 53 yards and a touchdown against the Arizona Cardinals. In week 2 with Cam Newton, 13 targets, 5 catches for 61 yards against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on a Thursday night. He gets to take on the Houston Texans, who have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. I love Curtis Samuel's ability, and I think if Kyle Allen plays again, that's actually a positive for his fantasy production. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. My name is Steven Andress. If you have any questions for this week, be sure to comment below here on YouTube. Give us a like, subscribe here on the page as well. I'd be happy to answer any of your lineup or trade questions for week 4, and best of luck the rest of the season.